Hello everyone, welcome to StudySavvy. In today's audio podcast, we will be studying class 12 biology NCERT, biodiversity and conservation line by line. So take a moment to relax, focus your attention and let's begin the calm reading of biodiversity and conservation. If an alien from and distinct galaxy were to visit our planet Earth, the first thing that would amaze and baffle him would most probably be the enormous diversity of life that he would encounter. Even for humans, the rich variety of living organisms with which they share this planet never ceases to astonish and fascinate us. The common man would find it hard to believe that there are more than 20,000 species of ant, 3 lakh species of beetles, 28 species of fishes, and nearly 20,000 species of orchids. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists have been trying to understand the significance of such diversity by asking important questions. Why are there so many species? Did such great diversity exist throughout Earth's history? How did this diversification come about? How and why is this diversity important to the biosphere? Would it function any differently if the diversity was much less? How do humans benefit from the diversity of life? Biodiversity. In a biosphere, immense diversity or heterogeneity exists not only at the species level but at all levels of biological organization, ranging from macromolecules within cells to biomes. Biodiversity is a term popularized by social biologist Edward Wilson to describe the combined diversity at all levels of biological organization. The most important of them are genetic diversity. A single species might show high diversity at the genetic level over its distributional range. The genetic variations shown by the medicinal plant Rauwolfia vomitoria growing in different Himalayan ranges might be in terms of the potency and concentration of the activated chemical reserpine that the plant produces. India has more than 50,000 genetically different strains of rice and 1,000 varieties of mango. Species diversity. The diversity at species level, for example, the Western Ghats have a greater amphibian species diversity than the Eastern Ghats. Ecological diversity. At the ecosystem level, India, for instance, with its deserts, rainforests, mangroves and coral reefs, wetlands, estuaries, and alpine meadows, has a greater ecosystem diversity than a Scandinavian country like Norway. It has taken millions of years of evolution to accumulate this rich diversity in nature, but we could lose all that wealth in less than 2 centuries if the present rates of species losses continue. Biodiversity and its conservation are now vital environmental issues of international concern as more and more people around the world begin to realize the critical importance of biodiversity for our survival and well-being on this planet. How many species are there on Earth and how many in India? Since there are published records of all species discovered and named, we know how many species in all have been recorded so far. But it is not easy to answer the question of how many species there are on Earth. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources (IUCN) 2004, the total number of plant and animal species described so far is slightly more than 1.5 million, but we have no clear idea of how many species are yet to be discovered and described. Estimates vary widely and many of them are only educated guesses. For many taxonomic groups, species inventories are more complete in temperate than in tropical countries. Considering that an overwhelmingly large proportion of the species waiting to be discovered are in the tropics, biologists make an statistical comparison of the temperate tropical species richness of an exhaustively studied group of insects and extrapolate this ratio to other groups of animals and plants to come up with a gross estimate of the total number of species on Earth. Some extreme estimates range from 20 to 50 million, but a more conservative and scientifically sound estimate made by Robert May places the global species diversity at about 7 million. Let us look at some interesting aspects about Earth's biodiversity based on the currently available species inventories. More than 70% of all species recorded are animals, while plants including algae, fungi, bryophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms comprise no more than 22% of the total. Among animals, insects are the most species-rich taxonomic groups, making up more than 70% of the total. That means out of every 10 animals on this planet, 7 are insects. Again, how do we explain this enormous diversification of insects? The number of fungi species in the world is more than the combined total of species of fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. In figure 13.1, biodiversity is depicted showing species number of major taxa. It should be noted that these estimates do not give any figures for prokaryotes. Biologists are not sure about how many prokaryote species there might be. The problem is that conventional taxonomic methods are not suitable for identifying microbial species, and many species are simply not culturable under laboratory conditions. If we accept biochemical or molecular criteria for delineating species for this group, then their diversity alone might run into millions. Although India has only 2.4% of the world's land area, its share of global species diversity is an impressive 88.1%. That is what makes our country one of the 12 mega diversity countries of the world. Near 45,000 species of plant and twice as many of animals have been recorded from India. How many living species are actually there waiting to be discovered and named? If we accept May's global estimate, only 22% of the total species have been recorded so far. Applying this proportion to India's diversity figures, we estimate that there are probably more than 1 lakh plant species and more than 3 lakh animal species yet to be discovered and described. Would we ever be able to complete the inventory of the biological wealth of our country? Consider the immense trained manpower, taxonomists, and the time required to complete the job. The situation appears more hopeless when we realize that a large fraction of these species face the threat of becoming extinct even before we discover them. Nature's biological library is burning even before we catalog the titles of all the books stocked there. Patterns of biodiversity. Latitudinal gradients. The diversity of plants and animals is not uniform throughout the world but shows a rather uneven distribution. For many groups of animals or plants, there are interesting patterns in the diversity, the most well known being the latitudinal gradient in diversity. In general, species diversity decreases as we move away from the equator towards the poles. With very few exceptions, tropics latitudinal range 23.5 north to 23.5 south harbor more species than temperate or polar areas. Colombia, located near the equator, has nearly 14,000 species of birds, while New York at 41° north has 105 species and Greenland at 71° north only 56 species. India, with much of its land area in the tropical latitudes, has more than 12,000 species of birds. A forest in the tropical region like equator has up to 10 times as many species of vascular plants as a forest of equal area in the temperate region like Midwest of the USA. The largely tropical Amazonian rainforest in South America has the greatest biodiversity on Earth. It is home to more than 40,000 species of plants, 3,000 of fishes, 1,300 of birds, 427 of mammals, 427 of amphibians, 378 of reptiles, and of more than 125,000 invertebrates. Scientists estimate that in these rainforests there might be at least 2 million insect species waiting to be discovered and named. What is so special about tropics that might account for the greater biological diversity? Ecologists and evolutionary biologists have proposed various hypotheses. Some of important ones are speciation is a generally function of time. Unlike temperate regions subjected to frequent glaciations in the past, tropic latitudes have remained relatively undisturbed for millions of years and thus had a long evolutionary time for species diversification. B. Tropical environments, unlike the temperate ones, are less seasonal, relatively more constant and predictable. Such constant environments promote niche specialization and lead to greater species diversity, and there is more solar energy available in the tropics, which contributes to the higher productivity. This in turn might contribute indirectly to the greater diversity. Species area relationships. During his pioneering and extensive exploration in the wilderness of the South American jungles, the great German naturalist and geographer Alexander von Humboldt observed that within a region, species richness increased with an increasing explored area, but only up to a limit. In fact, the relation between species richness and area for a wide variety of taxa, angiosperms, plants, birds, bats, freshwater fishes turns out to be a rectangular hyperbola. On a logarithmic scale, the relationship is a straight line described by the equation log s equals to log c plus z log A, where S is species richness, A is area, Z is the slope of the line, regression coefficient, C is the y-intercept. Ecologists have discovered that the value of Z lies in the range of 0.1 to 0.2 regardless of the taxonomic group or the region, whether it is the plants in Britain, birds in California or mollusks in New York State. The slopes of regression line are amazingly similar, but if you analyze the species area relationship among very large areas like the entire continent, you will find that the slope of line to be much steeper, Z values in the range of 0.6 to 1.2. For example, the frugivorous fruit-eating birds and mammals in the tropic forest of different continents, the slope is found to be 1.15. What did the steepest slope mean in this context? More species means less area. The importance of species diversity to the ecosystem. Does the number of species in the community really matter to the functioning of the ecosystem? Yes. This is a question for which ecologists have not been able to give a definite answer. For many decades, ecologists believe that communities with more species generally tend to be more stable than those with less species. What exactly is the stability for a biological community? A stable community should not show too much variation in productivity from year to year. It must be either resistant or resilient to the occasional disturbance, natural or man-made, and it must be resistant to the invasions by alien species. We don't know how these attributes are linked to species richness in a community, but David Tillman's long-term ecosystem experiments using outdoor plots provide some tentative answers. Tillman found that the plots with more species showed less to year-to-year variation in total biomass. He also showed that in his experiments, increased diversity contributed to higher productivity. Although we may not understand completely how species richness contributes to the well-being of an ecosystem, we know enough to realize that rich biodiversity is not only essential for ecosystem health, but imperative for very survival of the human race on this planet. At a time when we are really losing species at an alarming pace, one might ask, does it really matter to us if few species become extinct? Would the Western Ghats ecosystem be less functional if one of its tree frog species is lost forever? How is our quality of life affected? Say, instead of 20,000, we have only 50,000 species of ant on Earth. There are no direct answers to such neat questions, but we can develop a proper perspective through an analogy, the rivet popper hypothesis, used by Stanford ecologist Paul Enrich. In the airplane's ecosystem, all parts are joined together using thousands of rivets species. If every passenger traveling in it starts popping a rivet to take home, causing a species to become extinct, it may not affect flight safety, proper functioning of the ecosystem initially. Whereas more and more rivets are removed, the plane becomes dangerously weak over a period of time. Furthermore, which rivet is removed may also be critical. Loss of rivets on wing, key species that drive major ecosystem functions, is obviously a more serious threat to flight safety than loss of few rivets on the seats or window inside the plane. Loss of biodiversity. While it is doubtful if any new species are being added through speciation into Earth's treasury of species, there is no doubt about their continuing losses. The biological wealth of a planet has been declining rapidly, and the accusing finger is clearly pointing to human activities. The colonization of the tropical Pacific islands by humans is said to have led to the extinction of more than 2,000 species of native birds. The IUCN Red List 2004 documents the extinction of 784 species, including 388 vertebrates, 359 invertebrates, and 87 plants in the last 500 years. Some examples of recent extinctions include the dodo, Mauritius, quagga, Africa, thylacine, Australia, Steller sea cow, Russia, and three subspecies, Bali, Javan, Caspian, or tiger. The last 20 years alone have witnessed the disappearance of 27 species. Careful analysis of records shows that extinctions across taxa are not random. Some groups like amphibians appear to be more vulnerable to extinction. Adding to the grim scenario of extinctions is the fact that more than 15,500 species worldwide are facing the threat of extinction. Presently, 12% of all bird species, 23% of mammal species, 32% of all amphibian species, and 31% of all gymnosperm species in the world face the threat of extinction. From a study of life of history on Earth through fossil records, we learn that large-scale loss of species like the one we are currently witnessing have also happened earlier, even before humans appeared on the scene. During the long period, that is more than 3 billion years, since the origin and diversification of life on Earth, there were 5 episodes of mass extinction of species. How is the sixth extinction presently in progress different from the previous episodes? The difference is in the rates. The current species extinction rates are estimated to be 100 to 1000 times faster than in pre-human times, and our activities are responsible for the faster rates. Ecologists warn that if the present trends continue, nearly half of the all species on Earth might be wiped out within the next 100 years. In general, loss of biodiversity in a region may lead to decline in plant production, lower resistance to environmental perturbations such as drought, and increased variability in certain ecosystem processes such as plant productivity, water use, and pest and disease cycles. Cause of biodiversity losses. The accelerated rates of species extinction that the world is facing now are largely due to human activities. There are four major causes. The evil quadrant is the sobriquet used to describe them. Habitat loss and fragmentation. This is the most important cause of driving animals and plants to extinction. The most dramatic examples of habitat loss come from the tropical rainforest. Once covering more than 14% of the Earth's land surface, these rainforests now cover no more than 6%. They are being destroyed fast. By the time you finish reading this chapter, 1,000 more hectares of rainforest would have been lost. The Amazon rainforest, it is so huge that it is called the lungs of the planet. Harboring probably millions of species is being cut and cleared for cultivating soya beans or for the conversion to grasslands for raising beef cattle. Besides total loss, the degradation of many habitats by pollution also threatens the survival of many species. When large habitats are broken up into small fragments due to various human activities, mammals and birds requiring large territories and certain animals with migratory habits are badly affected, leading to population declines. Overexploitations. Humans have always depended on nature for food and shelter, but when need turns to greed, it leads to overexploitation of natural resources. Many species extinctions in the last 500 years, Steller sea cow, passenger pigeon, were due to the overexploitation by humans. Presently, many marine fishes population around the world are over-harvested, endangering the continued existence of some commercially important species. Alien species invasions. When an alien species is introduced unintentionally or deliberately for whatever purpose, some of them turn invasive and cause decline and extinction of indigenous species. The Nile perch introduced into the Lake Victoria in East Africa led eventually to the extinction of an ecologically unique assemblage of more than 200 species of cichlid fish in the lake. You must be familiar with the environmental damage caused and threat posed to our native species by invasive weed species like carrotgrass, parthenium, lantana, and water hyacinth (Ecorenia). The recent illegal introduction of African catfish, Clarius garipinus, for the aquaculture purposes is posing a threat to the indigenous catfishes in our rivers. Coextinctions. When a species becomes extinct, the plant and the animal species associated with it in an obligatory way also become extinct. When a host fish species becomes extinct, its unique assemblage of parasites also meets the same fate. Another example is in the case of a co-evolved plant pollinator mutualism, where the extinction of one invariably leads to the extinction of other. Biodiversity conservation. Why should we conserve biodiversity? There are many reasons, some obvious and others not so obvious, but all are equally important. They can be grouped into three categories: narrowly utilitarian, broadly utilitarian, and ethical. The narrowly utilitarian arguments for conserving biodiversity are obvious. Humans derive countless direct economic benefits from nature: food, cereals, pulse, fruits, fiber, construction material, industrial products, tannins, lubricants, dyes, resins, perfumes, and products of medicinal importance. More than 25% of the drugs currently sold in the market worldwide are derived from plants, and 25,000 species of plants contribute to the traditional medicines used by native people around the world. Nobody knows how many more medicinally useful plants are there in tropical rainforests waiting to be explored. With increased resources put into bioprospecting, exploring molecular, genetic, and species level diversity for products of economical importance, nations endowed with rich biodiversity can expect to reap enormous benefits. The broadly utilitarian argument says that biodiversity plays a major role in many ecosystem services that nature provides. The Dwindling Amazon forest is estimated to produce through photosynthesis 20% of total oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. Can we put an economic value on this service by nature? You can get some idea by finding out how much your neighborhood hospital spends on a cylinder of oxygen. Pollination, without which plants cannot give us fruits or seeds, is another service. Ecosystem providers through pollinators layer. Bees, bumblebees, birds, and bats. What will be the cost of accomplishing pollination without the help from natural pollinators? There are other intangible benefits that we derive from the nature, the aesthetic pleasures of walking through thick woods, watching spring flowers in full bloom, or waking up to a bulbul song in morning. Can we put a price tag on such things? The ethical argument for conserving biodiversity relates to what we owe to millions of plant, animals, and microbe species with whom we share this planet. Philosophically or spiritually, we need to realize that every species has an intrinsic value, even if it may not be of current or any economic value to us. We have a moral duty to care for their well being and pass on a biological legacy in a good order to the future generations. How do we conserve biodiversity? When we conserve and protect the whole ecosystem, its biodiversity at all levels is protected, and we save the entire forest to save the tiger. This approach is called in situ or on site conservation. However, when there are situations where an animal or plant is endangered or threatened, organism facing a very high risk of extinction in the wild or in the near future, and needs urgent measures to save it from extinction, ex situ off site conservation is in the desirable approach. In situ conservation. Faced with the conflict between development and conservation, many nations find it unrealistic and economically not feasible to conserve all biological wealth. Invariably, the number of species waiting to be saved from extinction far exceeds the conservation resources available. On a global basis, the problem has been addressed by eminent conservationists. They identified for maximum protection certain biodiversity hotspots, regions with very high levels of species richness and high degree of endemism, that is, species confined to that region and not found anywhere else. Initially, 25 biodiversity hotspots were identified, but subsequently 9 more have been added to the list, bringing the total number of biodiversity hotspots in the world to 34. These hotspots are also the region of accelerated habitat loss. 3 of these hotspots, Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, Indo-Burma and Himalaya, cover our country's exceptionally high biodiversity regions. Although the biodiversity hotspots put together cover less than 2% of the Earth's land area, the number of species they collectively harbor is extremely high, and strict protection of these hotspots could reduce the ongoing mass extinction by almost 30%. In India, ecologically unique and biodiversity rich regions are legally protected as biosphere reserves, national parks, and sanctuaries. India now has 14 biosphere reserves, 90 national parks, 448 wildlife sanctuaries. India has also a history of religious and cultural tradition that emphasize protection of nature. In many cultures, tracts of forest were set aside and all the trees and wildlife within were venerated and given total protection. Such sacred groves are found in Khasi and Jaintia Hills in Meghalaya, Aravali Hills in Rajasthan, Western Ghat of Karnataka and Maharashtra, and the Sarguja, Chanda, and Bastar areas of Madhya Pradesh. In Meghalaya, the sacred groves are the last refuges for a large number of rare and threatened plants. Ex situ conservation. In this approach, certain animals and plants are taken out from their natural habitat and placed in a special setting where they can be protected and given special care. Zoological parks, botanical gardens, and wildlife safari parks serve this purpose. There are many animals that have become extinct in the wild but continue to be maintained in the zoological parks. In the recent years, ex situ conservation has advanced beyond keeping the threatened species in enclosure. Now, gametes of threatened species can be preserved in viable and fertile conditions for long periods using cryopreservation techniques. Eggs can be fertilized in vitro, and plants can be propagated using tissue culture methods. Seeds of different genetic strains of the commercially important plants can be kept for long periods in seed banks. Biodiversity knows no political boundaries, and its conservation is therefore a collective responsibility of all nations. The History Convention on Biological Diversity, the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, called upon all the nations to take appropriate measures for the conservation of biodiversity and sustainable utilization of these benefits. In the follow-up, the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in 2002 in Johannesburg, South Africa, 190 countries pledged their commitment to achieve by 2010 a significant reduction in the current rate of biodiversity loss at a global, regional, and local levels. Summary of this chapter: since life originated on Earth nearly 3.8 billion years ago, there had been enormous diversification of life forms on Earth. Biodiversity refers to the sum total of diversity that exists at all levels of biological organization. Of particular importance is the diversity at genetic, species, and ecosystem levels, and conservation efforts are aimed at protecting more diversity at all these levels. More than 1.5 million species have been recorded in the world, but there might still be nearly 6 million species on the earth waiting to be discovered and named. Of the named species, more than 70% are animals, of which 70% are insects. The group fungi has more species than all vertebrate species combined. India, with about 45,000 species of plants and twice as many of animals, is one of the 12 mega diversity countries of the world. Species diversity on Earth is not uniformly distributed but shows interesting patterns. It is generally the highest in tropic and decreases towards the pole. Important explanations for the species richness of the tropics are: tropics had more evolutionary time, they provide a relatively constant environment, and they receive more solar energy, which contributes to the greater productivity. Species richness is also the function of an area or of a region. The species area relationship is generally a rectangular hyperbolic function. It is believed that communities with high diversity tend to be less variable, more productive, and more resistant to biological invasions. Earth's fossil history reveals the incidence of mass extinctions in the past, but the present rates of extinctions, largely attributed to human activities, are 100 and 2,000 times higher. Nearly 700 species have become extinct in recent times, and more than 15,500 species, of which more than 650 are from India, currently face the threat of extinction. The causes of high extinction rates present include habitat, particularly forest loss and fragmentation, overexploitation, biological invasions, and co-extinctions. The Earth's rich biodiversity is vital for the very survival of mankind. The reasons for conserving biodiversity are narrowly utilitarian, broadly utilitarian, and ethical. Besides the direct benefits, food, fiberwood, and pharmaceuticals, etc., there are many indirect benefits we receive through ecosystems, services such as pollination, pest control, climate moderation, and flood control. We also have a moral responsibility to take good care of Earth's biodiversity and pass it on in good order to our next generation. Biodiversity conservation may be in situ as well as ex situ. In in-situ conservation, the endangered species are protected in their natural habitat so that the entire ecosystem is protected. Recently, 34 biodiversity hotspots in the world have been proposed for the intensive conservation efforts. Of these, three Western Ghats, Sri Lanka, Himalaya, and Indo-Burma cover India's rich biodiversity regions. Our country's in-situ conservation efforts are reflected in its 14 biosphere reserves, 90 national parks, more than 450 wildlife sanctuaries, and many sacred groves. Ex situ conservation methods include protective maintenance of threatened species in zoological parks, botanical gardens, in vitro fertilization, tissue culture propagation, and cryptopreservation of gametes. And with this, we come to the end of the chapter Biodiversity and Conservation. Thank you for listening to this audio reading podcast on StudySavvy. Keep learning. Bye. See you next time.